رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Everyone can hear me okay? All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I wanted to start off with a memory from graduate school. I'm sitting in one of my cubicles on campus. And as I'm working, and of course everything is open air so you can hear what everyone's saying, I hear a colleague beside me. He's talking to one of the professors, and when you're in our program, you have to serve as a teaching assistant. So you serve as an assistant for the Islamic studies courses, the Arabic courses, and all of that fun stuff. And so he's sitting there and he's whispering, cognizant of the fact that we're all, in the same room as him. And he goes, today we had Hadith for class, right? The topic in today's class for their Islamic studies course was Hadith. And so naturally, whatever I was doing, I stopped. I was like, all right, let me perk up here what this person was saying, because he was saying it very excited. And he goes, this is what I did to teach them Hadith. I had them play a game of telephone. Anyone here play telephone? What's the point of telephone? The point of the game of telephone is to show you exactly how something that's said by someone gets mutilated by the time it hits the third person, the fourth person, the fifth person. And so I remember thinking about that moment so often, because I kept thinking to myself, is Hadith like a game of telephone? Is the science of Hadith, the way Hadith was preserved, the way that we understood what the Prophet ﷺ said, is it like a game of telephone? And I want you guys to think about that question as well, because the answer isn't a clear-cut, absolutely not answer. There are some things about telephone, the idea of passing things along, the idea of passing things by meaning, not by word for word. There are still some sort of remnants of the game of telephone. And hopefully by the end of this weekend, you can come to that conclusion, whether or not, or how similar Hadith is, the preservation of Hadith, of what the Prophet ﷺ said, is to a game of telephone. So if you can go ahead and, sorry, you're going to be the slide guy? Oh, Bismillah, awesome. Before we begin, just want to jog our memories, and I think Ustad Zainab had talked about this, but it's really important to begin, no matter what, distinguishing between Sunnah and Hadith. And this is going to be extremely important tomorrow when we talk about sort of the, quote-unquote controversial Hadith, or things that make us, question or think twice. Because what Sunnah is the normative legacy of the Prophet ﷺ. Click. Right? What the Sunnah is when you look back at the entire legacy of the Prophet ﷺ, what did he exemplify? What were the messages that he sent? And Dr. Jackson has a really good example as to understand, what does Sunnah mean? Sunnah, let's say we're all examining the Prophet ﷺ. Am I too close to the mic? That the Prophet ﷺ, you've got a few companions, they're sitting in the bushes. And every single day they're watching what the Prophet does, exactly what the Prophet ﷺ is doing every single day. And just for the sake of this exercise, this is not an actual hadith. And they're sitting in the bushes and watching what he does, and they notice that every single day he comes home, he brings a rose to his wife. And so you've got companions sitting in the corner, here, thinking to themselves or witnessing to themselves, okay, today here I am, I witnessed the Prophet ﷺ bring a rose to his wife. Next day, same thing happens. Third, fourth, fifth. Months go by, and every single one of these days, the Prophet ﷺ is bringing a rose to his wife. Now, every single companion, you got 3 companions in the bushes, right? They're all different companions. They all see the same thing. Later on, when we get the report, when they tell people 10 years later, 20 years later, yeah, I was in the bushes that day the Prophet ﷺ brought a rose to his wife, that becomes a single hadith. That report, that single text of what the Prophet ﷺ said, what he did, what he approved of, those are a hadith. Now let's see what the difference is between Sunnah and Hadith here. We've got now 20, 30, 40, 50 different hadith, a single report, saying that verily, we were there on the day of Dhul Hijjah, 12th of Dhul Hijjah at sunset, when the Prophet returned home, and we saw him carrying a rose and he gives it to his wife, whatever. That's the hadith, that's the report, right? But one day, there's a companion sitting in the bushes, and guess what? The Prophet does not bring a rose home to his wife. And so what's going to happen 5, 10, 20 years later? This companion says, well, I was sitting in the bushes. I didn't see the Prophet bring a rose home to his wife. That too becomes a hadith. So let's say now, 1,000 years later, you're going through a hadith collection and you come across this hadith that says, verily I was sitting in the bushes on this day and the Prophet comes home empty-handed. If you read that hadith outside of the context of all of these different ahadith, you are missing what the sunnah is. The sunnah is the entire big picture, the legacy of the Prophet. If you look back on his entire life, what does that tell you about the Prophet's character? What does that tell you about how the Prophet ruled, how he dictated things, how he brought us laws? You have to have that entire big picture. So you want to think of hadith as puzzle pieces that you're going to piece together, and when you get that final picture, that's going to be your sunnah. And so that's a very important distinction, because a lot of times we confuse the two. You can have a different hadith on everything, right? You can have hadith on so many different topics, but if you don't look at the entire context, then you're not going to get that full picture. Now, when these companions are sitting in the bushes, or just in general, we can switch to real life now, the companions weren't always recording everything the Prophet said. And in fact, I think as Imam Sulaiman had talked about, there was a difference. At one point, the Prophet ﷺ said, hey, don't write things down. And later we see that he encouraged people to write it down. But they're not always writing every single thing the Prophet ﷺ said. That you got to think about it. If I'm a companion and I'm living in the presence of the Prophet of God, it's not necessarily your knee-jerk reaction to think that you're going to have to write every single thing, because you're living his words. You're living Islam with him. That you're praying with him. That you know what he is saying through that practice. And so there's not this immediate need to write everything down. And, just as you think of your teacher or a parent or a grandparent, someone that you really respect, someone tells you something, your teacher comes and say, hey, it's like, that one of those teachers where you're just awed by, that, man, I want to be like this person when I grow up, or you sort of get shivers when they talk to you because you respect them so much that you've always looked up to this, grandparent or leader in the community or someone in your life. If someone tells you something, if someone comes up, think of that person right now. If that person comes up to you right now and says, listen, this is what you should do. You've got things going for you. You're a great person at what you do. I think that in the next 10 years, you should do X, Y, Z. You should really focus on memorizing Quran. You should really focus on your prayer. Most of us, that memory is going to be etched in our heads forever. That moment, we're going to think about everything that happened. Like, I can't believe he's just said that to me. I can't believe she just told me that you're going to remember it, right? So when you think about the preservation of hadith, you want to recognize the real human aspect behind this relationship, that it's the Prophet and the companions, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, radiyallahu anhum, that this is something that you're really going to remember. It's not just, I remember the Prophet so-and-so saying once upon a time. No, they were obsessed with him, and they knew he was the Prophet of God and really understood and respected that. And at the same time, you think about what is that human nature of things? But at the very same time, we also know the historical, the cultural context, that 7th century Arabia was a highly developed oral, they had a highly developed oral tradition. That the seerah, the life of the Prophet ﷺ, is filled with examples of these famous poets. That poetry, these people weren't writing poetry down and thinking about, what's the next line, or how things. But it was exactly that. It was something that they did orally, that they memorized, they passed down from generation to generation. And so the companions of the Prophet ﷺ are inheriting that legacy, that idea that you're going to also remember things and recall things orally. So you have several different things that play to this history of what we're collecting from the Prophet ﷺ. Then the Prophet dies, ﷺ. And lo and behold, the community doesn't take long before the community starts to have disagreements. And at some points, you're going to have serious, major disagreements. And what eventually happens is that you have what becomes dubbed as the fitna, a civil war. And so this fitna is happening, And you have companions on both sides. You have people who knew the Prophet ﷺ, and you have people who didn't know the Prophet ﷺ, but you have these major disagreements, and what's going to naturally happen when think about like when you're in a fight with your spouse or with your parents or your siblings or whatever it is. Well, mom said I can do this, or whatever. Remember when you said that? You start quoting things. So companions are doing the same thing. Well, the Prophet ﷺ said X, Y, Z. And whatever they're quoting the Prophet ﷺ saying, it's supporting their position on the side of the argument they're on, right? And now this is when the companions really start to perk up. Oh man, like, you're telling me the Prophet ﷺ said that and that conveniently works for your argument? You better tell me who told you that. Where did you hear that from? Who told it to you? When did the Prophet ﷺ say it? What did he say? So yeah, there's, if you read this off the bat and you think, oh wow, look at, they're disagreeing. See, day one, and this is, I promise you live through it. This is what you're going to hear if you take courses at university level. See, look guys, the Muslims started fighting the second the Prophet ﷺ dies, and they start making up hadith. But then you look at what's actually happening. This is actually proof for the preservation of hadith, because what do the companions do in response? Excuse me, what did you just say? Who did you hear that from? And you have really what becomes like almost this culture of interrogation in order to preserve the legacy, the words of the Prophet ﷺ. It's something they took extremely seriously. And so I think one of my favorite examples, because it really encompasses a lot that's happening here, is I have this example in the Istidrakat of Aisha. Badruddin Zarkashi writes this book of all the times Aisha radiallahu anha corrects the companions. So this hadith, كنا في مجلس فيه زيد بن ثابت. So we're sitting in a majlis, sitting in a gathering, Zayd ibn Thabit, a big companion, is there. We're talking about a fiqh issue. And Zayd ibn Thabit says that, XYZ happens during intercourse, you have to make a ghusl. So there's a companion sitting there, and, he's like, I've never heard of this. So imagine this group of companions are sitting together. Zayd ibn Thabit says, you know what? If this XYZ happens, this is what you do. This is what I heard from the Prophet ﷺ, or this is what the Prophet ﷺ said or did. This guy gets up. His first reaction goes straight to Umar ibn Khattab. This is obviously after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. Goes straight to Umar ibn Khattab. He's like, man, listen, I was sitting in this gathering. Zayd ibn Thabit, he said this and this. And, that raised a red flag. I thought to myself, I don't know about that. So right away, okay, context here, guys. Umar al-Khattab, terrifying, right? The last person you want to be told on is to Umar al-Khattab. What does he tell this man that was in the majlis? He tells him, اذهب أنت بنفسك. You go yourself. You're the one who heard it. You can testify against this man. You go yourself. فأتني به حتى تكون أنت شاهد عليه. You go, bring him to me, and you're going to tell me exactly what you heard him say, and you're going to put him, essentially recount it as a test, as a shahid, as a witness. So this guy goes back and he brings Zayd ibn Thabit and he brings him to Umar al-Khattab. Umar al-Khattab is sitting here, and you've got big people. You've got Ali ibn Abi Talib with them, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, big companions of the Prophet ﷺ, people who were very close to the Prophet ﷺ. And Umar al-Khattab looks at him and he says to him, not like, hey Zayd, what's going on? Assalamu alaikum, nice to see you. Because again, think about it. The companions were really dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Prophet. This is no joking matter. This is no time for fun and games. And he says, أَيْ عُدَيْ نَفْسَ. Oh, you enemy of yourself. Who do you think you are? That, أَيْ عُدَيْ تَفْتِ النَّاسِ بِهَذَا. Are you going around telling people fatwas of what the Prophet ﷺ said? I mean, imagine standing in front of Umar al-Khattab and being told that. I'd pass out, right? And this guy was, what does he do? Hands up right away. He's like, listen, man, I promise you, I did not make this up. He says, I want to take the example. أَمَا وَاللَّهِ مَا ابْتَدَعْتُهُ. I swear to God, I didn't make this up. وَلَكِنْ سَمِعْتُهُ. I heard it from so-and-so, and I also heard it from another companion. I heard it from all these different people. Listen, man, I didn't make it up. The Prophet ﷺ said this. I promise, that because this is a serious issue here. We're going to keep each other in check, and we're going to know exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said. He said, listen, these are the people I heard it from. I swear to God. I did not make this up with the Prophet ﷺ. So Umar al-Khattab looks around, he looks at the companions that are around him, mentioned that these are big companions, right? He says, hey, what do you guys think about this? Have you guys heard anything from the Prophet ﷺ? So they're using the community as a collective for verifying and preserving the truth. Looks around, he says, hey, you heard of this? And there's disagreement. Some are like, well, I think that's what I've heard. Some say, you know what? I've never heard that. Red flags go up. What is Umar al-Khattab? Clicker? Awesome. Clicker. So Umar al-Khattab says, you know what? So then it was suggested to Umar al-Khattab, how about you go ask the wives of the Prophet? Is it a fiqh question, a ruling regarding intercourse? So you know what? The wives of the Prophet ﷺ will probably have heard or known the answer to this. So first, Umar al-Khattab sends to his daughter Hafsa, and he asked for an answer, and she's like, listen, I don't know the answer to this. Goes to Aisha anha, and luckily for Zayd ibn Thabit, Aisha confirms that is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said and did. And from that point forward, Umar al-Khattab follows that fiqhi ruling. This is a really good example because it shows that commitment the companions had to preserving that truth. But it also shows us the importance of what becomes officially later on the isnad. Who told you that? Who did you hear it from that the Prophet ﷺ said it? And so that is where you get really the beginning of the isnad. All right, let's do this. Down arrow. The isnad. So isnad is usually is translated as chain of transmitters. The actual word in Arabic means support. Who is supporting your claim? You're saying the Prophet ﷺ said it. Who told you what? Who is supporting the claim that you're making right now? Who's giving you this information? And that information, what they're saying the Prophet ﷺ said, what he did or what he approved of, those are what compile our hadith that I think we covered earlier. That is what becomes our metin. It becomes the actual report, the text, the wording, what the Prophet not just said, not just the wording, but also his actions, and again, things that he approved in his presence. Now, the idea of confirming and just becoming a part of an isnad was, again, to document that something actually came from the Prophet ﷺ, came from himself, to be able to verify who said it from what to what to what, right? Because now we're going to start going from the Prophet ﷺ and we're going to move throughout history. And so what you have also then is someone like Abdullah ibn Malik, he says the following. Sorry, that looks like the Arabic text got corrupted here. But Abdullah ibn Malik says something really important, and this becomes something that's repeated in almost any hadith textbook that you open up. Inna al-isnad min ad-din, that the isnad is from our religion. And if it wasn't, وَلَوْلَا الْإِسْنَادِ, if it wasn't for this isnad, if it wasn't for this idea that we have a chain of someone verifying that's going back to the Prophet, لَقَالَ مَنْ شَاءَ مَا شَاءَ. Anyone could say whatever they want. If you can't tell me who you heard the Prophet ﷺ say it from, you can say whatever you want. I can wake up tomorrow and say the Prophet ﷺ said, eat chocolate every day for breakfast. Right? And I mean, obviously, that's a bit facetious, it's a joke in that sense, but that's exactly what could have happened the second the Prophet ﷺ passed away. Enemies of the Prophet could have said that. Companions who didn't know him or didn't know any better. That if it wasn't for this idea of verifying who told you that, anyone can say whatever they wanted. And this now becomes something extremely important throughout Islamic history because it's not just about preserving what the Prophet ﷺ said. That's 100% its priority. But the isnad plays another role. The isnad becomes a link back to the Prophet ﷺ. That if I can say that one person, two person in our era, 27 people, if I can connect back to the Prophet ﷺ through a chain, it's a blessing. It's a connection to the Prophet ﷺ. That I learned from my teacher, who learned from his teacher, who heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ. That is an honor. And so the isnad plays this role, and we'll see that in the next session, as to wanting to be able to build an isnad. You want to be able to build that connection that takes you all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. That it's really that link. You're connecting yourself. Not also now in our day and age, it's not just about connecting ourselves to the Prophet ﷺ, But along the way, you're connecting yourself to all of these different scholars, giants of the past, who dedicated their lives. And so it's almost like this heritage that you have as a Muslim, as a scholar, that you can be able to connect yourself back to this legacy, this tradition. And so it represents eventually this timeless tradition of passing knowledge from generation to generation. So, excuse my lack of graphic skills, but I figured this did the job. So, you've got a companion, and the successors of the tabi'een, it's the generation that comes after the companions, that are narrating a metin that goes to the Prophet ﷺ. But what's important here is that the Prophet saying something, you don't always just have one companion hearing him and then one successor hearing him. You end up having, he says it to the companion, another companion was there, or he says it to different companions at different times. So you have multiple, what is, I don't know if this has like a red thing. Oh, perfect. Okay, so you have here, this is an isnad back to the Prophet ﷺ, right? And what you end up having here as a distinction is you have different riwayats that go back to this method. So here, what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, whatever he said or did or approved of, that's the metin, goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. And then you have that sanad. But you're going to have different isnads. You're going to have different riwayats, different versions, essentially, of that sanad. And we'll get to the importance of that later. But the idea is that when we look later, just as like sort of a sneak peek, when you look into the science of hadith criticism of, okay, did the Prophet ﷺ say it? We're not just saying, okay, one person, we're going to trust one person who trusted another person who trusted another person, but we also have different versions of every isnad of what the Prophet ﷺ said that we can compare and contrast to. And it really is, it's important to see what that looks like because it really shows how committed that the companions were in terms of preserving it and how much the science essentially proliferated throughout history. And so, also what this is helpful to look at is that you're going to have different asanid that go back to the Prophet ﷺ that have different riwayat. The wording might change by a word or two, a letter or two, that the Prophet ﷺ is narrating that same big message. You're going to have these. And at some points, and that's what we'll get to next, you're going to have tens of these, 20, 30. And sometimes you're going to have 1, 2, 3 of these chains that go back to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's what brings us to our most important distinction, which is the terms mutawatir and ahad. That if you only have 1 or 2 or 3, just a few of these chains going back to the Prophet ﷺ, that's going to be considered a khabar ahad, which we'll get to. But first, we talk about mutawatir. If you're going to have, I actually think it's 2 slides down. This is terrible, I know, I'm sorry. But what's nice about the fact that you can't read it is to show you how intensely these asanid can get, right? That this is the Prophet ﷺ all the way up here, and then you have like 10 companions narrating something, and that's going to proliferate. It's going to go to the successors, tabi'in, the people that come after the successors, and then, of course, throughout history, that you have that proliferation. But in the cases that you see this, where you see 10, 20, 30 people going back, narrating something of what the Prophet ﷺ said, that is what is considered mutawatir. Okay, what's the highway that is right next to us? I-90? I don't know, sorry, I don't know in Chicago. 94? Okay. So, this actually worked out really good, this example, considering the storm. You're sitting here, and you're sitting in the lobby this morning, and you're waiting to, the retreat's about to start. You're sitting there, and you're on your phone waiting for a friend, and you hear a group of Michiganders come in. Man, those roads on I-94, awful. Did you see that accident? There was a massive accident. That truck flipped over right in front of our eyes this morning at I-94. And you're sitting there, your ears pick up, and you think to yourself, oh, that's interesting. Like, maybe there's an accident on I-94. And then another group of Minnesotans come in. Anyone here from Minnesota? Oh, actually, they probably get hit. I mean, last time I was here, there was like a huge crowd from Minnesota. Anyways, let's say that the Minnesotans were able to catch their flights and they came in and they're coming in from the airport and they're like, man, they walk up, they're walking past you and they're like, that accident was nuts. Then your friend texts you, you're waiting for your friend, and they're coming in from, I don't know, suburbs of Illinois, and they say, hey man, listen, I'm running really late. There's a nasty accident on I-94. This huge truck flipped over. You're reading through the news, right? And there's all these different reports. The idea of mutawatir is that there are so many people, and this is, I just give an example of 3. Now let's imagine 5, 10, 15, 20. Some ahadith that we have that go back to the Prophet ﷺ, we have 70 different chains. The idea of mutawatir is that there are so many people telling you something that they witness with their empirical senses, they witness with their own eyes, that they saw that truck flip over on I-94. And they're all from different places that يستحيل عليهم الكذب, that it's impossible that they all came at the Hyatt at 5 a.m. and decided, a group from Minnesota, a group from Michigan, a group from, Florida, all came together. Hey guys, let's devise this plan where we're going to tell this guy here this morning, some truck flipped over on I-94. That's logically inconceivable that they would do something like that. So many people from different places that don't know each other witness something themselves who are now reporting an incident. That is what we call a mutawatir hadith. I mean, it's the idea of knowing that Beijing exists, right? I imagine, I don't know, anyone been to Beijing? Okay. We all know Beijing exists. Why do we know Beijing exists? Because we have so many people telling us, from people that don't know each other, that have no collective interest, that would not have been able to come together and make it slide, telling us, hey, there's a city called Beijing, right? That's exactly how mutawatir plays out in ahadith. That there are certain things that happen in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. That the Prophet ﷺ says, "Man kadhiba alayya muta'ammidan," whoever lies about me intentionally, فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ فِي النَّارِ, then let him prepare a seat in hellfire for himself. You've got tens and tens of companions narrating this. They're not talking to each other. They all heard from the Prophet ﷺ. And those companions, you've got, some say up to 70. Imagine 70 companions for one single hadith, who then tell the successors, who then tell others. That is mutawatir. That there's so much proliferation. It's so massively transmitted that it provides us what we consider to be a certain knowledge. That we know for a fact the Prophet ﷺ said this or did this because there are so many different people telling us that this is exactly what happened. And so when you think about the idea of a mutawatir hadith, the hadith that is mutawatir, you don't even need to look at who said it. You don't necessarily need to look, is this companion just and known for lying? Are they known for being upright in their character and all of the different things that are needed for science criticism, hadith criticism? You don't have to do that because there's so many people okay, say this guy is a liar. Cut him out. Look at the other 10 chains, 20 chains that we know for a fact the Prophet ﷺ did this. And so you have, some say, up to over 100 hadith that are mutawatir from the Prophet ﷺ. And now, the catch is that if a hadith is not mutawatir, it doesn't fall under this category where there's no set number to be clear, but if you don't, let's say, over 10 people narrating this from the Prophet ﷺ, anything that does not meet the criteria of being a mutawatir hadith is considered to be ahad, khabar ahad. Now, ahad, if you translate it, means a singular report. It comes from ahad, right? One. This is very misleading because if I'm telling you if it's either mutawatir or ahad, your assumption is going to be what? There's going to only be one single chain that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's not the case. So the advice here is always to remember ahad in the Arabic version. It's ahad, you refer to ahad, or recognize the fact that when we say singular, it does not mean there's only one isnad. Ahad can mean there's one isnad, two asanid, 3, 4. And going back to that example, this would be considered ahad hadith with these two different chains. So the majority of ahadith are actually ahad. You only have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, after explaining mutawatir, you probably think to yourself, why in the world would we take ahad hadith when we have mutawatir? But this is exactly where the science of hadith criticism comes into play. that this is exactly why they even built this science. Because mutawatir hadith is certain knowledge. We can know that for a fact that this happened because so many people said it, that it's inconceivable for it to be a lie, that we don't even need to go back and double check things. That when it comes to ahad hadith, it gives us what's called a probabilistic knowledge. That the Prophet ﷺ, unlike mutawatir, we can confidently say the Prophet certainly said this, ahad hadith are going to give us probabilistic knowledge that the Prophet probably said this. You probably think to yourself, like, why would we take things that the Prophet probably said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And that's where that criticism comes in. That scholars come in and then they start telling us, they start grading these asanids and telling us, well, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, 99% probably said this. Probably can take that if we're 99% sure. Or the Prophet ﷺ, there's like a 10% chance the Prophet ﷺ said it. Now, obviously, these hadith scholars were not working with percentages, but they were working with categories. They created the category of sahih, which is sometimes translated as authentic. Hasan, good. Da'if, weak. Forgery, mawdu'a. And then you have different, and then that becomes even more detailed. Sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li dhatihi. You have this entire science, which we're going to explore this weekend. It's going to tell me, you know what? There's a really, really, really strong chance the Prophet ﷺ said it, but epistemologically, in order, the idea of us taking it at face value, we can't say 100% the Prophet ﷺ said it, but we can say, let's say the 50 to 60% range, the 70 to 80, the 90 to 100, and that's exactly what these scholars were doing. They were coming in here and giving us, building this entire science to tell us that what is sahih, what is hasan, what is forged, what is weak, all of these different categories. And so, this is not, it shouldn't surprise us that we have the majority of ahadith or ahad. That doesn't mean we don't take them, doesn't mean we throw them out, but that's exactly where we have the majority of ahadith that we're faced with. And from there, what we're going to do is we're going to now look specifically, at least in terms of isnad criticism, we're going to look, all right, who said it? Let's start fact-checking. Do we trust these people? Do they have a full chain back to the Prophet ﷺ? If there are multiple different isnads, like the graph that I showed you, of what the Prophet ﷺ was saying, do they corroborate one another? Do they support one another? And so, again, this is where you have that entire science come up. And so, this also helps clarify why we still accept quote-unquote weak hadith. Because, again, we're working on this scale of certainty and probability. How much the Prophet ﷺ probably said something, and how much we know that he certainly said it. But in our cases here, ahad hadith, there's still a very good chance the Prophet ﷺ said it. And that's why we take it. So this next session, I wanted to talk about, move a little more. Okay. Can I switch to the next session right away? All right, yeah. Oh, little, okay. Well, anyways, so just for the next session, we're going to look at the collections. So now we got, all of these different things that the Prophet ﷺ is saying. We've got some with a few asanid, some with, 10s, 20s, and 30s. What happens with that? How do we preserve it, and how do those collections of ahadith come, and how we have them today? And so that will be the focus of the next session, inshallah. So I think we have time for a few Q&A. We've got this documentation of what the Prophet ﷺ is saying. We've got all these different ahadith, we've got all of these different reports. And as we mentioned, a lot of these are being orally preserved, where we're teaching others orally. We're telling you, hey, this is what the Prophet ﷺ said, this is who I heard it from, this is what you're going to do, right? Now, it's important to add a little more context to it. Paper, the luxury that we have today, was not introduced to the Middle East until from China, until the late 700s. It's like well over 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ passes away, right? So the companions can't just pull out paper to start writing. That is not something that they do, but they have other options, obviously. They can use papyrus, they can use animal skin, they can use palm fronds, different natural resources they can use, but you know what? Those are pretty expensive, and sometimes it takes a lot to be able to prepare these materials in order to be able to write on them. So the very first collection of ahadith that we get is something called a sahifa. Now, what sahifas are essentially private, they're small notebooks for companions. It's my personal notebook. I've got a few camel skins, I've got some parchment paper, I've got papyrus to write on, but that is going to be really what becomes the private notes of individual companions. We've got companions like Jabir ibn Abdullah, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abu Huraira, Abdullah bin Amr ibn As. They're some of the companions who are known for leaving behind sahifas. All of their notes of what the Prophet ﷺ said written down and that they would keep for themselves. And you think about it, ironically, the people who had the companions who were writing these down, who actually collected the most hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Huraira. Do you know how long Abu Huraira was in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ? How many years? 3. He was in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ for 3 years. Abu Huraira has over 5,000 hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. And oh boy, do critics love this one. First thing you learn in Islamic Studies class 101. This is exactly why you cannot trust hadith, because this companion, Abu Huraira, the Muslims all love, he was only around the Prophet ﷺ for a few years, and he magically has over 5,000 narrations. Isn't that a little suspicious, just a little? And then you have, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar al-Khattab. He was only 23 when the Prophet ﷺ died. Only 23. He didn't know him for very long. Second largest collection. And so it's funny, ironic, right? That you might think to yourself, like, why are the companions who are much younger, why don't we have Abu Bakr, Umar al-Khattab, people who spent a vast majority of the prophetic life on the Prophet ﷺ side, why aren't they narrating? There's something weird about this, right? Maybe we can't trust hadith because look what's happening here. But in fact, we have to bring that human element back into this conversation. Because if I'm only around the Prophet ﷺ for a few years and I didn't really get to know him, think about like that grandparent you've always wanted to know, but passed away when you were young and just was a legacy, or someone in your family that there was 2 generations ago that was super well respected within your family or within the community, and you've just wanted to know everything about them, or a teacher, anyone really. You're going to want to, man, I would love to learn more about my grandfather's life. I don't know enough about his life. So I didn't get to spend my whole life with him. So I'm going to spend the next 10, 20 years dedicating my life to collecting stories about the Prophet ﷺ, collecting what he said. I love him. I want to learn everything about him. And I'm going to sit and collect. So in a way, it's not surprising that you have these younger companions who are coming in and have this obsession with what the Prophet ﷺ said. And, well, if they're not around the Prophet ﷺ, how are they getting this information? Well, they're going to more senior companions. They're going to companions who are older, that spent more time with the Prophet ﷺ, and they're getting that information from him. And so, it's interesting because if you look at the way these hadith are written by these younger companions, you're very rarely going to find someone like Abu Huraira saying, I heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ, said X, Y, and Z. Rather, you find the Prophet ﷺ said X, Y, and Z. It's a very important distinction, and that becomes a part of hadith criticism. This person saying they heard it directly from the Prophet, or they heard the reporting that the Prophet said X, Y, and Z. All these little differences, whether they said an or min or whatever the word letters are, or if they heard it from someone about the Prophet, or if it's going back to the Prophet, or they're jumping a person to get back to the Prophet ﷺ, all of these become little nuances. This becomes almost an obsession of hadith scholars in the most positive of ways to determine the authenticity of the hadith. And so a lot of times you have these companions, these junior companions, who are collecting information of what the Prophet ﷺ said from senior companions. And so Abu Huraira is excited. He's collecting his notes of what the Prophet ﷺ said. He's going around asking, he's writing things down, and he's preparing what end up becoming very thorough sahifas. Well, as I mentioned, a sahifa is something private, it's personal. He's not going around writing these and sending to the publishing press and having these widely distributed. But really what a sahifa was something that was like a memory aid. Just gonna jog your memory. Okay, if anyone's seen my writing, I write like chicken scratch. If I'm gonna take notes, you better believe no one in this room can read these notes. I can't even read the notes sometimes. But think of sahifas like that they're going to, I know, well, hopefully they can read their own notes, but at least in my case, it's so severe. But if they're going back and they're reading their own notes, it's not meant for you to go pick up someone else's notebook and read through it. That they're using it because, again, it's still that oral tradition, that's still that history is there. So they're using it as memory aids. You know what, I'm collecting thousands of hadith. You can write things down now to just, jog your memory. Okay, this is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said. And you know what? Also, context here, Arabic script didn't always have those diacritical marks. Don't have the vowels, don't have the dots. So when we say they're notes, we really mean notes. Because if you know what letters look like without dots, you're going to, or vowels or harakat or diacritical marks, this is what it's going to look like. What does this say over here? Baits? Okay. What is it? Thabata. It could be nabat, it could be a plant, or it could be the verb version of planting. It could be baits, a house. It could be a letter seen. Bint, daughter. Also verb forms, bannata. Yathibu, to leap or jump. Yathibu, add a little shadda, it can change the whole word. Thabata, to establish, to prove. You can make probably another 100 words out of just these letters. So when I tell you they're notebooks, right? And that is exactly what, you don't pick up someone else's notebook because you would have to hear it directly from the person who's writing these things. This is important because in order to hear a sahifa, you hear it from this original transmitter. That you really, in order to avoid grave misunderstandings of what the Prophet ﷺ said, you got to hear it directly from the person who is taking these notes and knows the context and who also studied or heard it from someone else directly. So oral tradition is still flourishing very strong at the time of the companions, radiallahu anhum. And in fact, so strong that if hadith transmitters had a reason to believe that you read a hadith and you didn't hear it from someone, you're out, right? It's going to affect your reliability. It's going to affect if you're going to be trusted in hadith transmission. Because again, you have this oral history, this legacy. You got to hear it from someone so you make sure that you heard it right. And make sure you don't make these mistakes. Again, all testifying to really the beauty of the accuracy of hadith preservation. So let's fast forward about 100 years. We're leaving from the Prophet ﷺ's time, went to looking at the companions. Now we're in about the early to mid 8th century. This is the stage of the tabi'in, the successors. Companions, you got the Prophet, the generation, you've got the companions generation. Generation that comes immediately after them are the successors. Now, let's imagine one of our most famous tabi'is, Hassan al-Basri. Now, Hassan al-Basri, he's studying with companions like Anas ibn Malik, he's met and heard and transmitted hadith from companions. That's what makes you successors, having that interaction with the companions. But the time of the successors, you're living in a generation where a lot of people have never met the Prophet ﷺ. They've never met him. Then anything they know about their religion, anything they know about their beliefs is coming from where? The companions. And so when the faith is starting to spread, when people are trying to study their religion, Islam, and what the Prophet ﷺ did and how he prayed and everything like that, they're going to do things like what we do in our age, where we've never met the Prophet ﷺ. You're going to go up to a teacher, you're going to go up to a scholar, so Hassan al-Basri is sitting around in the masjid, and he's going to be Not just saying, okay, the Prophet ﷺ said this and this and this and this, and just listing off any hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said. He's going to start grouping them together. Today we're talking about salah. This is all the different things that the Prophet ﷺ said about salah. And so now you see hadith, when they're being transmitted topically, by subject. So musannafs are topical collections. You're going to learn about your faith the same way we learn about our faith today. All right, we're talking about zakat today. Here's everything the Prophet ﷺ said about zakat. Listing hadith after hadith after hadith. And so this oral tradition, this living tradition that's happening, again, that humanistic element that's happening here, that's translating into the hadith collections. So you have the rise of something called a musannaf. Just as the successors are now doing this, they are now collecting, they are now preserving it in the same manner. So you've got these books organized by topics. And this is the first time this happens, obviously, in the hadith collections. And you have chapters organized by these topics. So it really shows the emphasis now. Our focus and attention is now about our faith, our practice, our rituals, what we do as Muslims. The earliest surviving musannaf, any guesses here? Nope. Close. Oh, that's a good one. Yes, okay. So, yeah, Abdurrazzaq Musannaf is very, very famous, but I'm going for the famous one here is Imam Malik's Muwatta. Oh, wow. Sorry, you really can't see that. Sunnah.com. I would highly recommend it. So, the earliest surviving musannaf is Imam Malik's Muwatta. And my eyesight is awful, but I think the first one is the Times of Prayer. Yeah, I'm not even going to try to read that. But for those of you who can see it, or look it up online, if you look at how the Muwatta is organized, it's by prayer, ilm, fasting, this and that, right? It's topic by topic by topic. That wasn't the case with the Sahifas. The Sahifas were everything that they could document from the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, you're getting a little more intentional. We're starting to organize things by topics. Now, the version, so things get interesting here. Imam Malik's Muwatta isn't just prophetic hadith. You've also have in his Muwatta the rulings of companions. You've got the practice of scholars of Medina. And you've also got opinions from Imam Malik himself. And if you're thinking like most people, you're thinking, how in the world do we take the Muwatta? This is ridiculous, right? We need the words of Prophet ﷺ. And so, what does this mean? Now we're thinking, well, they're trying to mix and match the words of the Prophet ﷺ. How can we trust this stuff? And I'm really emphasizing this because the second you step into a non-Muslim world, unfortunately sometimes Muslim world, you're going to be bombarded with these types of questions. It's helpful to know and reassuring and build conviction in any case. But the version of the Muwatta that becomes famous in North Africa, and like Al-Andalus, it contains 1,720 reports. Out of the over 1,700 reports that you have in there, only about 500 are prophetic. And you got over 600 from the companions, you've got 200 from the tabi'een, 300 from the tabi'een, you've got opinions from Imam Malik himself. And so, when you think about this, despite the fact that it might raise red flags, like why are these being collected in what should be only what the Prophet ﷺ, these hadith collections, prophetic hadith collections books, is that you got to think about Imam Malik himself. Just like Hassan al-Basri, he's sitting around answering people's questions. They're not coming and thinking to themselves, this is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said and that's it, matter's closed. Imam Malik's looking around and saying, well, the scholars of Medina who saw the companions who saw the Prophet ﷺ pray like that, well, they probably are praying like that because they saw the Prophet ﷺ, they actually prayed with the Prophet ﷺ like that. That's pretty good evidence. That at this point in history, I'm going to give you everything I know about the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm going to give you everything I know about the legacy of the companions. Because right now what we're trying to do is learn how to be Muslim. We're trying to practice our faith, and we're going to use any resource that helps us do that. And so, there is this leniency at the very beginning because you don't have, what becomes all of these fiqh books that we have. You don't have the four schools of law that are official at this point. That you're still trying to piece together these puzzle pieces, and that is what the Musannaf includes, is you've got those hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But we're not really obsessed if this is a sahih, like 100% the Prophet ﷺ said it. We're not really obsessed with, okay, is every single person in this isnad someone we can rely on through and through? No, but again, because we're just trying to know everything we can. Prophet might have said it. If he didn't, the companions probably did, and they lived with the Prophet, and they embodied what the Prophet ﷺ said. So let's do that, right? So it's very much a practical resource when you have these compilations of these topical books, that you're also collecting anything from the companions as well as people who are living during the era of the successors. So last point on the Musannaf, what's interesting is that later on in history, because we have the companions' statements in something like Imam Malik's Muwatta, when we start to get really specific about a hadith and the isnad and who said what, these become really helpful resources. Because we can look back and say, you know what? If we're looking at a hadith 100 years later and we're trying to figure out if the Prophet ﷺ said it, or if it got mixed up in the batch, we can look back at something like a Musannaf and say, well, no, we know the Prophet ﷺ didn't say it, because look, Imam Malik is citing a companion. So somewhere along the line, some person in this isnad, in this sanad, this chain, or something along the way might have changed, but we know these end up helping us. They serve our purpose of actually verifying hadith later on. Next we get to, let's move a few decades only. We're now in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. So we've got the Sahifas, sort of ad hoc collections, right? That we're just collecting everything we know about the Prophet ﷺ. Musannafs, now we've got the topical references, they're organized by subject. We now have the emergence of musnads. The most famous one, as we'll come to see, being the musnad of Imam Ahmad. So, any guesses as to how musnads were, wait, did I give it away? Sorry, I gave it away. That was not planned. But musnads were organized by, if you can hear the word, musnad comes from the same root, sanad. They're organized by their chains of transmission. They're organized by their isnads. So, if I'm putting together a musnad, I'm going to organize my hadith, not by topics, but all of the hadith that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu narrated, all of his hadith are going to be in one section. And then from this companion and this companion, this companion, that all of them are going to be organized from not what the Prophet ﷺ, not the subject itself, not the topic, but who's in that chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ. And again, this is still pretty early on in history. So the chains aren't going to be 10 people long. It's going to have 2 or 3 people at this point. Now, organizing hadith collections based on isnad becomes important for 2 reasons. Number one, hadith forgery is still on the rise, right? You still have this major concern that people are making things up about the Prophet ﷺ. And so when you have organized texts based on isnad, you essentially, you're writing up all the different proofs that you have that's going back to the Prophet ﷺ. And you know what? It's pretty convenient having them all lined up, because now I can sit and compare this isnad to this isnad to this isnad. So it becomes really important for a tool for criticism to see if we have 5 isnads from Abu Bakr to the Prophet ﷺ. We can sit and compare and contrast because we put them all together in one place. You don't have to sit and flip through the book to see all the times that this companion narrates something from the Prophet ﷺ. And at the same time, you can also look at the metin here. You can look at, okay, what exactly the Prophet ﷺ said. And now let's sit and look at all of the different chains. We've got 3 or 4 different chains of going back to what the Prophet ﷺ said. Let's corroborate, let's see who's who in each chain, and whether or not the chains actually prove the same thing. That do they strengthen it? Do they weaken it? And essentially both telling us, giving us a tool to be able to compare and contrast in order to see who's saying what and whether or not that adds up, or we're seeing some red flags. You know what? The same person keeps saying things that the metin, what the Prophet ﷺ actually said, is a bit different. We got to investigate. So it's becoming a tool for investigation, having these things. And so here being, as I gave it away, like I gave this away, the most famous musnad that we usually refer to is the musnad of Imam Ahmad. Again, apologize for the small text. But if you look at the musnad, you have, my eyesight was bad enough, and now it's only about 1,000 times worse, so my contacts want to get blurry. But as most of you can probably read in this room, unlike me, you've got probably the musnad of Abu Bakr, musnad of Umar al-Khattab, right? You're organizing it based on who is reciting, who is narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. Now, musnads, sort of like a musannaf, are not recording things based on the full authenticity. So a hadith does not have to be sahih. It doesn't have to be in that range of like 80 to 90 to 100 or 99% probable to be included in a musnad. So the musnad of Imam Ahmad, any guesses how many ahadith are in there? Throw a number. A lot. That's a good answer. 1,000? 8,000. Man, you got them all. So there's over 27,000 ahadith in the musnad of Imam Ahmad. And so you're like, think about it. I mean, this is exactly what you're going to hear. Look at this. The Prophet ﷺ, you've got only a few thousand ahadith, and suddenly about 100, 200 years later, you got 27,000 ahadith. This is exactly what we're telling you guys. They're making these things up. But what the musnad functions as, it's actually a storehouse for every hadith from this person. If I can get every single hadith possible, every single chain for the hadith that Abu Bakr or Umar al-Khattab or whatever companion narrated, again, we're collecting anything, weak or not weak, forged or not forged, because, well, sorry, forged is a different discussion, but weak or not weak because we're trying to compare and contrast. We're trying to see if there are going to be any comparisons, anything to look at. So when you're trying to investigate something, imagine you're a journalist, right? You want as much data as possible. Raw data, fake data, weak data, because all of it together, when you put them all together, it's going to, and you can compare and contrast, you're going to be able to start picking out, this is a strong isnad, this is not. This is a strong hadith, this is not. And so, and you think about it, when you say there's 27,000 hadith in a musnad, it's not that there's 27,000 different things that the Prophet ﷺ is saying. Because again, we're looking at who's saying it from what. So you can have 10 different companions narrating the exact same thing from the Prophet ﷺ, and that technically in our eyes is just one hadith, right? But you can have 1,000 versions of that same hadith, but from different chains. So to sum up, we've got the musannafs, we got by subject, musnads, by their isnad. Now we're moving through time. We're looking now at the early 9th to early 10th century. And this is where it gets interesting, because I think this is the point in time where we're familiar with most. This is where we're combining the musannaf and the musnad, and we're starting to think about, well, let's actually look at the authenticity of these hadiths. Let's look at the strength of these sanads, and you get the genre of the sunan and the sahih books, quote-unquote authentic collections. So if you open a book like Sahih al-Bukhari, or any of these the books that we're familiar with today, just like we saw in the Muwatta, they're going to be organized by topics, right? You open up, it's bab so-and-so, the chapter on so-and-so, and anything related to that topic is going to be housed under that same section. So you've got a little bit of, you're getting a mix and match in terms of style. But, so unlike a musannaf, which is organized by topic, the Sunan Hadith books are going to be a little more particular. We're not going to include anything about this topic. It's got to meet a minimum requirement in terms of our Hadith criticism, of our authenticity. We're not going to include anything just because we think, there's a 5% chance the Prophet ﷺ said it. We're not going to include things necessarily just because the companion said it. We're going to be more intentional about which ahadith to include, but yeah, we're going to organize them similarly to a musannaf based on topics. So really, in sum, these books are collected based on their authenticity. So, within the realm of Sunan books, you also have that distinction that we see later on between quote-unquote Sahih or Sunan, that some books are only going to include hadith that meet the criteria to be Sahih, that it's going to fall in the range of 60 to 99%. Again, the scholars are not using percentages, but for our purposes here, it helps, at least helps me to think about it. That, we're not going to include anything that is hasan, is something that is sound. The Prophet said there's a good chance the Prophet said it, but we're going to be very, very strict. And so you have really the luxury. What these collections show you is the luxury that now that everything we've got, we're a couple hundred years removed from the Prophet ﷺ. We've had this deep science of hadith criticism. If you wanted to say the Prophet ﷺ said it, you had your chance. You had over 200 years. If you didn't say it, you're making it up at this point, right? If you are now suddenly there's a chain that's coming out of nowhere, then we know automatically that this is a forgery. And so now these scholars that are sitting in this era, they've got thousands of hadith to sift through. They have the tools and the resources now to be more particular. And so you have, again, the rise of these texts. So what we have is the two most famous hadith scholars of the Sunan movement, who are Bukhari and Muslim, right? Bukhari dies in 256, 870. So this is towards like the end of the 9th century that he passes away. And Imam Muslim passes away shortly afterwards. So they were the two first. Again, remember that distinction. Sunan, we're going to be particular about the hadith we're including, but it's going to include some that are good, maybe sometimes some that are quote-unquote weak. Sahih, Bukhari, Muslim are like, listen, we only want Sahih, nothing else, right? And so, if you look at Imam Bukhari's Sahih, by the time Bukhari is working on hadith collections, it was narrated that he had over 600,000 narrations to work with. I mean, Muslim, we said 27,000, that was a lot. No, it's reported that Imam Bukhari had over 600,000, over 500,000 hadith to sit and figure out what's right and what's wrong, but what meets the criteria of Sahih and what's not. But again, even when we say over 500,000, vast majority of those are just duplicates, but different chains of people saying that. And so, what we find in the book that we have today, if you open up a full book, a non-abridged version of Sahih Bukhari, you have over 7,000. Went from 600,000 down to 7,000. 7,000 full isnad narrations. And then, again, there's still repetitions within those 7,000. If you're only looking at what the Prophet ﷺ said or did, it boils that number down to around 2,600 hadith. And that is what is included in the Sahih of Bukhari. And then, of course, Bukhari, by the way, in Muslim, this is really interesting. They're the first people really to do this. No one before them was really like invested in, let's only like pick out what the Prophet really probably said. And so they launch what ends up becoming a movement, the Sunan movement, the Sahih movement. And you have people who follow in their suit, and people are looking around like, oh, maybe we should do that too. But just as a side note, for the record, during their lifetime, Bukhari and Muslim were actually criticized. What's it to you if the Prophet ﷺ didn't say Sahih? This is still something that is part of there's a good chance this is a part of the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ. That again, before this time, people aren't just tossing things out because they think it's weak and we shouldn't take it. The scholars recognize that there is still value in hadith that are not 100% certain. Because just because one hadith is not 100% certain doesn't mean the Prophet ﷺ didn't do it. And what you end up having is this idea of, well, let's look at, again, that normative legacy, that big picture. If there are different hadith that say the Prophet ﷺ did almost the exact same thing, they're going to start corroborating one another. That idea, whatever the Prophet ﷺ said, is going to start strengthening one another. So, I say this because I know a lot of times we think, we want to take a hadith, it's got to be sahih or out, right? That, it's weak, I don't have to follow it. But that's not what the legacy of our scholars taught us about understanding the Prophet ﷺ. That you can still get this collective image of what the Prophet ﷺ said and did through even things that we consider to be quote-unquote weak. Now, of course, there is debate in terms of where you can use weak hadith. I'm not saying to categorically use them, but the idea of this respect, of of taking the hadith, working with them diligently, is something that we need to still be cognizant of. But anyways, you've got people that follow suit, and like some people think this is a great idea, and you end up having the Sahihain, you got Bukhari Muslim, and then you have Sunan Abi Dawood, Sunan al-Nisa'i, Sunan Ibn Majah, and Jami' al-Tirmidhi. And these become what are known as the 6 canonical hadith books. Some say there's 4, some say there's 5, but by and large, if you've heard of hadith books, good chances you've heard of most of these. And when I say canonical, what I mean by that is that because these books were primarily compiled based on authenticity, we end up relying, in order to define what the Prophet ﷺ said, rather than going through various different texts that we can go through, you can still sift through the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, you can still go through the Muwatta, and that's something that's obviously still studied today. But by and large, most hadith that are going to help define fiqh, they're going to define our day-to-day lives, our understanding of what the Prophet ﷺ did, our understanding of the Quran, most of the time you're going to be able to find them in these 6 collections, and so those are usually the convenient resource that Muslims turn to today. But this is not all that's happening during this time. You also have different genres that arise. Look at just a few, and then we'll have time for Q&A, inshallah. But again, now you've got all these different hadith in front of you. You have the luxury of being having a little more fun with it, right? So you have now books that are compiled based on just a whole topic itself. So Bukhari is going to write a book called Adab al-Mufrad that looks at, manners and ethics. And all the hadith the Prophet ﷺ said about anything related to your character, your manner, your ethics, that's going to all be in this one book. Pretty convenient for us today. You've got An-Nawawi's Riyadh al-Salihin, usually a textbook staple in most homes. You have the 40 ahadith. You have books on at-Targhib and at-Tarhib, books about all the hadith that remind us of the punishments of the Day of Judgment and the rewards of the Day of Judgment, things to motivate you, things to really remind you not to do something you shouldn't be doing. You've got books on az-Zuhd, piety, the fada'il of the Sahaba, the virtues of the companions, Dala'il an-Nubuwah, the proofs of prophethood, the shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ, the characteristics, what the Prophet looked like, his actions, his character. So now this is all happening at this time. Again, because you've got all these hadith in front of you, we're sort of getting past this phase of we have to sit and analyze this hadith sahih or not, because that's been happening the past couple hundred years. At this point, we're starting to get a good sense, this is what the Prophet ﷺ most likely said. And so now we're going to put together these books that are solely on these topics. And so that becomes a genre, a hadith collection that becomes pretty popular. Okay, that's for tomorrow, inshallah. And then you have different books. You've got mu'jams. Mu'jams are pretty cool. This is happening in the 10th to 12th century, where you have, an author chooses a certain theme, and then essentially, shares as many possible hadith on that certain theme, because it's almost serving as a way to show how many hadith you know of the Prophet ﷺ on this topic. You think about it for a second. Let me tell you this. I tell you that someone's going and I'm writing a whole book just to show off how many hadith I know. Sounds pretty bad, right? Sounds pretty ego-centered. But it's important when these conversations are happening or when these thoughts come to mind to recognize sort of, again, that human element of what these people are doing. If I think of a mu'jam today, I'm proud, I'm honored. If I can try to collect anything that the Prophet ﷺ may have said, that's amazing. I want to have as many opportunities to connect myself back to the Prophet ﷺ. That it's not some way of necessarily showing off, but it's that pride, that obsession, that love that they had for the Prophet ﷺ. It goes back to what I said about the isnad, right? The isnad is not just about verifying the contents of the hadith. It's a connection to the Prophet ﷺ. I want to do anything I can to get even an inch closer to him. And so you have so many different collections that come about, and you have mu'jam is this idea of collecting as many hadith as possible. And in here, sometimes it doesn't matter if it's strong or if it's weak, but again, it's that form of connection to the Prophet ﷺ. And you have the idea of also of a mustakhraj. a mustakhraj hadith book. It's happening around late 9th to 11th century. So again, we're a couple hundred years removed now. We've got a lot of different ahadith. Mustakhraj is pretty genius if you ask me. I'm going to take Sahih Bukhari and all of the hadith he knows, I'm going to write my own book with those exact same hadith, but I'm not going to use Imam Bukhari's sanad. If you open Imam Bukhari's book, he's going to narrate what he heard, Imam Bukhari himself, from so-and-so back to the Prophet ﷺ. From Mustakhraj, I'm going to take exactly that hadith that Imam Bukhari wrote, and I'm going to use my own sanad. I'm going to say, well, I heard it from so-and-so and so-and-so back to the Prophet ﷺ. Honor, like this distinction that you have, that it's great that the Imam Bukhari did it himself, but let me collect what I have that connects me back to the Prophet ﷺ. And that if Imam Bukhari's sanad, if his isnad, his chain of transmission is authentic, then this is going to strengthen my chain of transmission. So the later genres that we have of these hadith collections really exemplify this desire, this love of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's just a reminder of not just this game of egos back and forth, because sometimes that's what you're told, to put it bluntly. But really, again, thinking of that human element of wanting to have that connection back to the Prophet ﷺ. And then you have various different collections that come along. You've got the 40 hadith collections, which are famous. And if you think about it, the idea, the Prophet ﷺ, it's a quote-unquote weak hadith that whoever memorizes 40 hadith from my sunnah of 40 hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, that he will be their intercessor on the Day of Judgment. And now if you're thinking like I think, the way that you're trained to think in this world is, well, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Why are we going to base all of these different books on the 40 hadith of the Prophet ﷺ if this hadith is not that strong? That's not the point. The point is, there's a chance the Prophet ﷺ might have said that. We have an opportunity to have not just me memorize 40 hadith, but get other people, to encourage people to memorize 40 hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ serve as an intercessor for them on the Day of Judgment. That's our goal. That's our end goal. And so, really, sometimes it's not just about tooth and nail. It's not just about the specific details. But you always want to keep in mind that there's an obsession to do anything, to not just connect yourself back to the Prophet ﷺ, but to be able to embody and pass along that legacy for generations to come. And with that, we'll conclude and open it up for Q&A. Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakumullah khair, barakallahu fiki. That's a lot of information to take in. You have a lot of good questions. So first off, so what about some of the more well-known companions? Why isn't there, for example, a Musnad of Abu Bakr, for example?
Great question. So going back to what I meant about the younger companions wanting to preserve that legacy because they didn't have that time with the Prophet ﷺ, it was the opposite effect for the companions of Abu Bakr and Umar al-Khattab, because they were living his legacy. It's not about, okay, let me write down what the Prophet ﷺ did, how he prayed. I'm going to pray exactly exactly how he did it, right? And so when you look at most of that older generation, the generation that was super close to the Prophet ﷺ, they're not narrating that many hadith because they're living his hadith and his legacy. And so that's why it becomes important later on for scholars of any really science, like fiqh, or understanding anything about this tradition. It's also to look at what those senior companions did. And later on, this becomes an important part of usul, of the foundations of law. Well, what are the companions, like Abu Bakr and Umar al-Khattab, during their time as khulafa, as caliphs? What did they say? Because even though they might not have directly narrated, they understood and they embodied that legacy of the Prophet ﷺ, and they're going to give us very important principles for us to apply in terms of the actual, again, that legacy of the Prophet ﷺ, and not always just the specific wording of what the Prophet ﷺ said.
So what about someone like Sheikh al-Albani? Where do these collections come in? And
so, contemporary-wise, Albani comes in and essentially redoes the sort of the science criticism of the isnad of the hadith. So, yes, we have people who've done it in the past. You've got Bukhari, you've got Muslim. Albani comes in and does it essentially all over again, based on his specific criteria. And so that's almost a part of the legacy that that Bukhari Muslim started in terms of looking at that criticism. And so to give context, Bukhari and Muslim, they have different conditions as to what constitutes sahih, what constitutes authentic. Very slightly different. And so in the case of Albani, his form of authentication is very isnad focused. And so then you have throughout history, you also have this idea of metin criticism. That you're not just looking at who said what, who said from who to who, but what exactly are they saying about the Prophet ﷺ? Is it logical that the Prophet ﷺ said it, that you're doing this type of metin criticism? This, of course, has very strict boundaries because sometimes logic isn't necessary. That what you think is logical does not mean it's a universal moral or principle. But in any case, that Albani is famous for doing specifically isnad-only criticism and trying to embody that legacy of Bukhari Muslim.
So can one nowadays safely open up a book by, say, Imam al-Nawawi, the 40 hadiths? Should they still study that with someone, or can they read that on their own and just derive lessons from it on their own?
Absolutely. And Nawawi's book is a very good example because scholars, we're not waking up in the 21st century and thinking, oh, look, like we're now smarter and we can understand these things. And I think that's almost always implicitly in our conversations that we're this idea of like moral progressivism, that we are more enlightened and more aware, understanding that we can go back to our tradition and be more critical and intellectual about it. These scholars are having the same exact conversations hundreds of years before. And so you have scholars debating hundreds of years ago, hey, should we take weak hadith? Should we even accept this? This is not something that is just a today problem. And, summary of those discussions, those debates was, listen, if it's not going to affect your aqidah, if there's something that's a weak hadith, it's not going to affect your understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not a major point of fiqh, it's not going to majorly affect the way that you're going to live your life. And you know what? For the most part, these weak hadith are coming into discussions of targhib and tarhib. Again, this idea of just motivational things that it might not be a sahih hadith that you need to read, Surah Yaqeen on Friday or in certain situations, or, pray 2 rak'at of gratitude, or do certain little things that, people practice today because it's a weak hadith. But that's okay, because you know what? At the end of the day, someone told me, I was reading Kahf once, Surah Kahf on Friday, and I'll never forget this. And they told me, well, what's the point? That hadith that encourages you to read Surah Kahf is not sahih. I think about this every Friday now. I think to myself, what would you gain from saying that? If there's a hadith, even if it's labeled as weak or hasan or whatever, not talking about this specific hadith, and it's encouraging people to do good, to bring them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to read Surah Kahf on Friday, even if it's not a sahih hadith, then that's something that we should encourage and encourage one another and encourage ourselves to do. And so most of these texts, when they're including weak ahadith, these are matters of just spiritual purity. And it's something that if it's going to motivate you or it's going to push you to not do something that you shouldn't be doing, then take it. Because that is what our scholars taught us.
So going back to the example you gave about the people traveling from different states, and you said it's just inconceivable for all of them to gather up and lie. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he had enemies in the munafiqun. Given that knowledge, why is it a stretch to think that they would band together to forge a fake hadith or cause corruption among Muslims?
Because part of the conditions for mutawatir is that these people don't know each other. So, I think, at least in terms of the munafiqun, the kuffar, a lot of these people are going to know each other. And well, there's a lot more in terms of like the actual criteria as well. I don't want to get into details, but in short, that is conceivable. If you're telling me all these people that hate the Prophet ﷺ come together and say this thing, it's going to raise a red flag, right? But if you're telling me all these people don't know the Prophet ﷺ, don't know the Prophet ﷺ, but that don't know each other, and that don't have a common goal of doing X, Y, Z, because if you have a common goal, if there's this shared interest, then that automatically defeats the conditions of mutawatir. So even just that example, think about it yourselves, like that's inconceivable if we know that there is that united goal.
So what would be a good place to start studying hadith on your own? Are there any reliable websites?
Great question. I was actually sifting through a lot because I knew this question was going to come up. Seeker's Guidance, or Seeker's Academy, I think, .com. Taysir Safi has an entire course, and it's excellent. Very respectable teacher, and he has much better presentations and graphs and all of that. It's a free course. Highly, highly recommend it. And then, to my bias, Jonathan Brown has a book on hadith, and it is probably the best book on hadith in the English language to date. So I would recommend you reading through that as well. A lot of this content actually came from him. So those are the two main ones. And then there are a few other books that are in English if you look it up online. Muhammad Mustafa A'zami, he wrote back, I think in the 70s, a book in English on hadith literature. Excellent book, not to discredit. It's not that, again, it's not that any of these texts are necessarily better in content, but in terms of like the English language and being able to read it through. The hadith by Jonathan Brown, hadith is called Hadith by Jonathan Brown, and then the course by Taysir Safi on seekersacademy.com is something I recommend.
And I'm going to second that. Dr. Jonathan Brown has some wonderful lectures regarding a hadith, truly just magnificent. There's a lot of questions regarding al-Bukhari himself, his life, his works. I'm going to recommend you all come early tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The whole entire session will be about Imam Bukhari himself. And so we'll go into all those as well. So is every mutawatir hadith considered sahih?
Mutawatir hadith does not go through that gradation. You don't look at mutawatir and say sahih, da'if, weak, strong, authentic, all of that. Because mutawatir knowledge by its nature is certain knowledge. Think of the Quran. Quran is considered preserved through mutawatir transmission, through massively wide transmission. There are so many companions, so many people in each rank of the tree of the Sanad that are narrating this exact same wording. It's mutawatir, not bil ma'na, not in meaning, but by word for word. I forgot the question. But yeah, so you don't look and say, okay, is this ayah sahih or da'if or whatever. No, but we know it gives you certain knowledge that this must have happened. This must have been said. So that question doesn't apply to mutawatir at all.
Are the 6 canonical books that you mentioned, are they all translated in English and reliably in English?
Sunnah.com, I don't know, they're up to something, man. They're beyond these 6 books. They're now translating. I think the screenshot that I had included earlier, they were translating already the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, and it said 4% done on the top. Oh, wait, I'm going on tomorrow's. Oh, yeah, look. You look to the top. I mean, that's pretty cool. 4% complete. Remember, you've got about 20,000 plus hadith to go. So, highly recommend them. They're very convenient.
Can you re-explain what you meant about Abu Hurairah's reporting that there were 5,000 hadith, and then I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was about just how was he able to compile that many hadith, and where do we go with the criticisms that come, especially from Islamophobes?
Yeah. So Abu Hurairah, even though he knew the Prophet ﷺ for such a short time, he dedicated the rest of his life to be recording hadith from more senior companions. So a lot of the hadith that Abu Hurairah narrates aren't narrated as I heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ, but the Prophet ﷺ said something that he had heard from a more senior companion. So I think that answers that, correct? Okay.
What are how about you yourself? Any personal go-to hadith books that you prefer? What's on your shelf at home right now?
Well, definitely Dr. Brown's book on hadith. I have is online PDFs, unfortunately. The actual full text names, I have about 10 different tabs open right now. I can write them all out. Or if someone's really interested, I can go ahead and share. But the classical texts that you go through with a teacher are works by Ibn Salah. And then there's sort of like a classical train across all schools of law that you study, this text with this commentary. And that, I think, Al-Bayquniya is the text actually that Ustad Taysir Safi uses for his Seeker's Guidance books. So time you take a hadith course, it's going to be those, and then everything else is almost always commentaries on those books. So yeah, plenty of short texts and then the PDF commentaries.
Okay. Is there still room in modern times for isnad criticism?
So that's why Albani is pretty controversial. Most scholars are going to say no, like that door has been closed. That if there was something that was going to be criticized, it was going to be found, it's already been found. So there's a website, and for the life of me, I could not find this website that my teacher had given me. I don't know if they took it down or not, but you can actually type in any hadith, and they will build that tree for you. And of course, conveniently, I'm going to probably remember it tomorrow or find it tomorrow. But any hadith you want, you can essentially type it in, and you can find the gradation for every single person in the chain. You can find all of the matching mutun, the text of that you're debating in terms of the Prophet ﷺ's, going back to the Prophet ﷺ. So basically, it's already been done, and you can find all that information. So even if you wanted to go back to go ahead and go ahead and criticize, knock yourself out. And that's actually an exercise that you do, like for the hadith course that I took. Our teacher would make us do that, and it was brutal because he wouldn't let you use computers as well, so you'd have to go and get thick textbooks and go through them and dig them up. And for every single, for one hadith to do that took 3 days, and he would give us easy hadith to do as well. So, but that's a good exercise to practice, just so you can admire and respect sort of the effort that goes into it. But now there's a website, and I will find this website one day, inshallah, that automatically does it for you.
Last question. So, now that we are certain by now that there's all these authentic collections of ahadith, especially with Bukhari and Muslim, why is it then that we still have these differences in the ummah instead of uniting with one another? It's a big question.
It's a huge question. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow, inshallah. So I think that will be addressed in the emotional discomfort talk. But I think, long story, TLDR, I'm so uncultured that it's fun to do things like that, that you have differences of opinion as to whether or not you can accept a weak hadith for certain areas of law. So some scholars will say, well, yeah, you can take weak hadith for certain areas. Some will disagree. Some will say, well, you can take the practice of Ahlul Medina, what the scholars of Medina were doing, that's as the Maliki school does, in order to help define the law. Some will say you can use hadith. Some say you can use mutawatir in certain areas. So the difference really becomes as to what is the minimum criteria for taking certain hadith in certain areas of law.
Jazakumullah khair.